This lecture is on the topic, the limits of change, and the focus question is, how did New Deal benefits apply to women and minorities? Roosevelt conceived of the Second New Deal's assistance to broad groups of needy Americans, the unemployed, elderly, and dependent, as a right of citizenship, not a special privilege. But the realities of inherited ideas about gender and black disenfranchisement in the South powerfully affected legislation. The New Deal affected different groups of Americans in very different ways. The New Deal incorporated women into government more than any other previous administration. A number of talented women, such as Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, advised the president and affected policy. The best known was Eleanor Roosevelt, who became the first modern First Lady, using her position for reform in civil rights, labor laws, and work relief. But organized feminism was absent in the 1930s. The Depression actually provoked calls for women to leave the labor market in order to open up jobs for unemployed men. The federal government enacted laws that led to the dismissal of female government employees, and many private employers denied jobs to married women. Even the CIO, which organized female workers, adhered to the notion that women should be supported by men. The ideal of the male-headed household powerfully shaped social policy. Because paying taxes on wages made one eligible for the most generous Social Security programs, old age pensions, and unemployment insurance, they did not cover most women because they did not work outside the home. The program excluded the 3 million mostly female domestic workers. Although Roosevelt strove to portray the federal government as representing all people in America, the power of the Solid South molded the New Deal welfare state into an entitlement of white Americans. With black disenfranchisement, Democrats controlled the South. Southern Democratic members of Congress were elected again and again by tiny white electorates. Because committee chairmanships rested on seniority, once the Democrats took control of Congress in 1933, Southerners took the key leadership positions. Roosevelt believed he could not challenge the Southern Democrats if he wanted New Deal laws passed. Southern Democrats excluded from Social Security agricultural and domestic workers, the largest categories of black employment. Only black organizations and the left pushed for truly universal social insurance. Congressman Ernest Lundeen in Minnesota in 1935 had introduced a bill to create a federal system of old age unemployment and health benefits for all wage workers and support for female heads of households with dependents, but it was replaced by the Social Security bill. Because of this Southern veto, most black workers were limited to the least generous and most vulnerable parts of the new welfare state. Direct public assistance programs were ostensibly open to all poor seniors and families with dependent children who demonstrated financial need, but benefits were set low and eligibility was determined by state and local officials, who had broad authority. In the South, this translated into widespread discrimination. Because recipients of direct assistance did not pay Social Security taxes, they soon bore a stigma of dependency on government handouts, which became known simply as welfare. The stigma intensified until pressure for reform led the federal government to abolish its responsibility for welfare in 1996 during Bill Clinton's administration. The Depression and the New Deal had contradictory impacts on the nation's racial minorities. Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier launched an Indian New Deal, ending the policy of coerced assimilation and granting unprecedented cultural autonomy. He replaced boarding schools with reservation schools and increased spending on Indian health. He also ended the policy implemented since the Dawes Act of dividing Indian lands into small individual family plots and selling off the rest. Federal officials now recognize the right of Indians to govern their own communities, except in areas covered by federal law. Though the New Deal was the most radical shift in Indian policy in American history, it barely improved living conditions on extremely poor reservations. The Depression devastated Mexican Americans, 400,000 of whom returned to Mexico when demand for their labor declined. Some were coerced into moving by authorities in the Southwest. Perhaps 200,000 Mexican American children who were born in the United States and were thus citizens were also pressured to move to Mexico. Those who stayed worked in desperate conditions on large corporate farms in the Southwest. The Wagner and Social Security Acts did not apply to agricultural workers, and when they tried to unionize, they were brutally suppressed. Mexican-American leaders tried to develop a strategy to claim rights as white Americans, but they also sought support from the Mexican government and promoted a mystical sense of pride and identification with Mexican heritage, later given the name La Raza. Always last hired and first fired, African Americans suffered the most in the Depression. Blacks who kept their jobs now competed with unemployed whites. Facing an unemployment rate twice that of whites, blacks benefited less from direct government relief and public works projects. The Depression forced blacks to make economic survival their primary demand. Even W.E.B. Du Bois surrendered his hopes for racial integration and urged blacks to think of themselves as a nation within a nation. He urged blacks to build an independent, cooperative economy within their own communities and take control of separate schools. While Roosevelt seemed little interested in race relations or civil rights, he appointed Mary McLeod Bethune, a well-known black educator, as his advisor on minority affairs, and other blacks to other positions. Key members of his administration, including his wife and Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, criticized segregation, disenfranchisement, and lynching. Blacks generally supported the New Deal and started voting for the Democratic Party, shifting away from their traditional support for Republicans. Their hopes for broader changes were stymied by white Southern Democrats' influence in the party. Federal housing policy powerfully reinforced residential segregations and showed the limitations of New Deal freedom. Local officials implemented national housing policy in ways that reinforced existing racial discrimination. Nearly all municipalities in both the North and the South insisted that housing sponsored by the federal government be racially segregated. The Federal Housing Administration also ensured mortgages that contained clauses barring future sale to non-whites. Federal employment practices also engaged in racial discrimination. In the federal government, few blacks held skilled or professional positions, and in the South, many New Deal construction projects refused to hire blacks. The New Deal's modernization of Southern agriculture led large landowners to displace tenant farmers, many of whom were blacks, from their lands. Only with the Great Society programs of the 1960s was the welfare state extended in ways to fully incorporate black Americans.